Hello, I'm Ms. Carmagno, and this is going to be a short lecture on what France was like right before the Revolution. You should be taking notes on your Intro to the French Revolution notes assignment as we go, so make sure you have that open. I want to start by talking about the players. These are the people that hold all the power during this time period. And the first one is King Louis himself. This is Louis XVI. He's the grandson of Louis XIV that we studied in the 1750s unit. He's not as charming or charismatic or as smart as his grandfather. He's actually kind of pathetic, sad, and a loser, but he's still the King of France. And with divine right monarchy in place, he has all the power. He has a huge debt as well that he inherited from his grandfather. He's not taking in nearly enough money for all the money that he is spending on parties and to bribe his nobles to behave and to keep his queen in the style that she has become accustomed. He takes terrible advice. He basically agrees with whatever the last person who spoke to him said, and so you can't really rely on him to have a coherent strategy for moving forward. He is considered extremely weak. He's married to Queen Antoinette, and she is actually the sister of his mortal enemy, the King of Austria. She comes to France without even knowing how to speak French. She doesn't follow French customs. She is completely isolated in the Palace of Versailles, where she really doesn't understand what the peasants are going through or what France is facing in terms of financial crisis. She loves to throw parties. She loves to have a good time. She loves to wear beautiful clothes, and she spends all of her money on those things, and a lot of the king's money too. She also gives King Louis terrible advice, and he takes it. Now, the first question I want to wrestle with is, where does Louis get all that money? Well, most of it comes from the peasants of France. They are taxed an enormous amount during this period. In fact, 50 cents of every dollar that the peasants make through their labor is given directly to the king to spend. And it really doesn't leave them very much to live on the rest of the year. Additionally, those who don't own land, and hardly any peasant does, had to work for others for very poor wages. Universally, they're working for the nobles. They're tied to the land that the nobles own, and they can't leave if the nobles abuse them. So this is pretty much a slave labor situation, but without race being a part of it. Finally, Louis is borrowing a lot of money. The banks can't really tell the King of France, yeah, we're not going to loan you any more money. You haven't paid back the money we loaned last year. So he just keeps taking money from the banks. And that is putting France in a very precarious financial situation. So what's he spending that money on? Well, entertainment. He throws wild parties. He pays for artists and musicians to entertain the nobles and himself. There's plays, there's operas. He spends a lot of this money on luxury goods, on fine wines and exotic foods and jewelry and clothing for himself and for his wife, on the manufacture of exquisite furniture and gold paint in the palace, all of those things. And he spends a lot of it on wars, which he mostly loses. So he doesn't get anything out of waging those wars. What could he have been spending it on? Well, he could have been spending it on infrastructure like roads and canals and bridges that would help France develop economically. He doesn't do any of that. It's actually really hard to walk from one end of France to the other. He could have spent it on schools, educating his population. And we know the more educated a population, the more successful the economy of that country. And he could have spent it on healthcare for all the veterans who came back from these wars maimed and abused and now burdens on their families. Or he could have just let peasants keep a little bit more of their money and put that back into the economy. There are 3 estates in France at this time, and they own different amounts of wealth. The vast majority of the people of France fall into the 3rd estate. That's the peasants. And these people make up 97% of the population, but they only own about 10% of the wealth, maybe even less than that. And they pay all the taxes. So out of that 10% of the wealth of France, they have to pay all the taxes for the whole country. There's 27 million of them, and they work long hours and have no rights. There's no legal protections for them. The second estate is the nobility. They make up 2% of the population, and they own about 90% of the wealth in combination with the clergy. And they spend that wealth on themselves for the most part. They get it through getting the peasants to work for them for almost nothing and collecting taxes from the peasants. They only make up about 120,000 to 350,000 people in all of France, and they have lots of rights and protections in the law. Mostly, they don't pay any taxes themselves, they just collect taxes. And the final rank in the estates of France is the first estate. These are the clergy, the church people. Now, some of these people are priests who work with the poor peasants of France, but most of them are rich members of noble families who've gone into the church and who have a very luxurious life. They make up only about 130,000 people, and they control vast amounts of wealth per person. The first estate and the second estate pay almost nothing in taxes whatsoever. So one of the big problems for the peasants is that they have no rights at all. The French peasants belong into three categories themselves. The first one is the bourgeoisie. These peasants are highly educated and they're pretty rich. They make things the nobles want, and they charge the nobles for those things, whether it's beautiful gowns or beautiful jewelry or beautiful furniture. These are the peasants who make those things. They also serve as lawyers and clerks, and they work for the nobles in other ways. Next, you have the poor peasants in the cities. These people labor in factories. They work service jobs as maids and cooks. And finally, we have the poor peasants in the countryside who farm the land and raise the livestock. They live desperate lives of poverty, and the nobles actually have the right to kill them without any provocation. So a noble can cut down a peasant in the field, just murder them outright, and it's not against the law. These people have almost no rights whatsoever under French law, and they're really, really suffering because of it. All right, that concludes our lecture. The next thing you're going to do is read a primary source document about daily lives of peasants in this time period from an Englishman wandering around France during this period. And you're going to be looking at a political cartoon and answering some questions, and a famous painting about the French Revolution and answer some questions. And then you'll be finished with this assignment. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.